Confessions of a Spanish Teacher, Part 5. In September 1995, my friend Martine came to see me with exciting news. I had met Martine while working at Ladbrokes, and we'd become good friends. She had since left Ladbrokes and was working in the NHS. She had married and started a family when very young, and had long wanted to separate from her husband. Her children were now adults and she had finally left him. One night she had been out for dinner with her brother-in-law, and he had told her that he had 3 villas in Spain that he had bought during the Thatcher boom. During the Thatcher recession, he had let them go a bit. He was a builder and had suffered greatly. The water and electricity were off. The community fees had not been paid, but there was no mortgage owing. They needed sorting out to be rented now things were improving, and he offered her the opportunity to live free of charge in one of the smaller ones if she did this for him, while renting the others out. Martine was hoping for an escape, I suppose, and she jumped at the chance. She was going over for a week first to get the water and electricity sorted, and I immediately offered to go with her. My last year at university did not start until the end of September. We booked our flights and that was it. Terry wasn't particularly happy, but we were not at a point yet where we were completely tied to each other, i.e. married, so there was not much he could do. I remember he tried to make me jealous, inventing all these things he was planning to do while I was away. I really didn't care. I just couldn't wait to get away and get some sun. Off we went. We had a fantastic time. I had never been to mainland Spain before, and apart from that, the weather was perfect. September generally is. I felt like I'd been released from prison. I did not behave myself that week, I'm afraid to say. I acted like a single woman. We both behaved like teenagers and we had a ball. That's the first and last time in my life that I've ever been unfaithful to anyone. The only excuse I have is the suffocation I had felt and the freedom I experienced on arriving in Spain. On the plane going back, my friend asked me, "What are you going to say to Terry when you get back?" I replied, "Nothing, it'll all be fine." You know when you say you're fine, but in fact you're not fine at all? Terry came to meet us at the airport. I took one look at him and I knew I had to leave him. I'm a person who wears my heart on my sleeve. I just could not pretend anymore. This has been the bane of my life, really, not being able to pretend or have a poker face. There was just no way I could carry on our relationship. The guilt I felt was unbearable. It was a Friday and I was working the next day at Ascot Racecourse. I told him I needed some breathing space and I would go straight from work to stay with my niece Michelle in London for the weekend. After work I set off. Maybe if he had given me breathing space, things would have been different. But he couldn't. That's really when the whole saga set into motion towards what seems now like an inevitable conclusion. On the M4 there was a massive traffic jam. While I was stuck in it with no end in sight, my mobile rang. It was Terry. He said that he'd taken an overdose and if I didn't come back straight away, he would die. I couldn't even move. The traffic was so bad. Finally, I rang my sister who rang the Samaritans and they went around to the house. I knew the Reading Samaritans personally as I'd been a volunteer there myself for 2 years. An ambulance was called but Terry refused to go to hospital. And the paramedics decided there was not a serious threat to his life and they left. My friend the Samaritan sat with him for a while. Then eventually Terry himself said he was okay. It sounds awful, but I knew then for sure I had made the right decision. I could not be blackmailed into going back to him. That and his subsequent actions drove me further away from him, not back towards him. He did not have the telephone number of my niece, thankfully. I would ring him and withhold my number. However, he had stolen my address book before I left, and he was constantly ringing my parents, my family, my friends to try and get the number and my address. I continued living at my niece's for quite a while, but the travelling from Reading to Edmonton just got more and more wearing. The distance was not that far, it was the traffic. Eventually, a fellow student, a single parent, offered me her spare room to help me out and help her out with the costs. It was a win-win situation. I obviously did not tell Terry that I'd moved back to Reading, though he tried his best to find out where I was. He would ring my friends in a panic, saying that something terrible had happened and he had to speak to me urgently, or my parents or other family members. They had all been briefed that under no circumstances should they give him my telephone number, that they should contact me and I would ring him from a withheld number. Life carried on. Gradually, he did seem to be accepting that we would not get back together. At least seemed to be. He had even answered some Lonely Hearts adverts and had some dates. I did feel a fleeting jealousy, which I suppose is what he wanted, but at heart I was just relieved that he had moved on. My friend and I were planning a Christmas trip to Spain, a month over Christmas and New Year, before she planned to move out there for good the following spring. Terry said he was worried about me and he offered to take my car for new tyres as we were supposed to be driving there. I let him. This new friendship was great and it was good to see him so upbeat, quite happy with the new woman he was seeing. Why shouldn't we be friends, helping each other? Just before we went away in the December of 1995, there was a meeting at Cheltenham that I attended. We stayed there for over a week. The night before we returned home, we all went out and got really drunk. And I spent the night in a nice hotel with a man that I'd worked with for 2 years. Funnily enough, I'd never really liked him, and I actually thought he didn't like me. He was also a terrible womanizer, and I just didn't really find that appealing. However, that night he made an orchestrated effort to impress me, and it worked. I was full of my newfound freedom and the awareness that I was free to do whatever I liked. A week later, Martina and I set off to Spain in my car. We took turns driving. Martina is one of those lucky people who can sleep in a car, whereas I am not. For me, it was a long journey. We did it all in one hit, 24 hours. We just could not wait to get there. In about the second week we were there, Martina and I had an argument. We had never had one before and we have never had one since. My period was due and I blamed my irritability on this. But Martine said to me immediately, "I think you're pregnant." This was a total shock to me. I hadn't even considered it. I had lived so long with a guy who was sterile, I'd not even had to think about birth control. I was in complete denial. At the same time, I was in contact regularly with one of my nieces, Joanne, who was also late. I was telling her to take a pregnancy test. And now she started telling me to do the same. The niece I'd lived with briefly, Michelle, was getting married in August 1996. I was to be matron of honour, and Joanne, her sister, was to be a bridesmaid. Neither of us made it. I bought my pregnancy test eventually in the first week of the new year from a supermarket in the town centre called Carrefour. When it turned out positive, I threw it to the other side of the room. I just could not believe it. Bear in mind that this is the girl who thought she was never going to get pregnant because she had a partner who was sterile. Also, even before that, I had never conceived and I'd never used birth control. So I had sort of half started to think that maybe I couldn't have children. I mean, it all seems silly now, but seriously, I'd almost forgotten about the possibility of getting pregnant. Although it was by no means a perfect situation, I was actually absolutely thrilled. I just could not wait to get back home and see my doctor to make sure that everything was okay. I immediately stopped smoking and drinking. So we set off back home and as we were coming home just over the French border, the car broke down. You will read a blog post later on in this book which talks of other bad experiences that I've had in France. It's like a black hole for me where everything goes wrong. We had literally just crossed the border and stopped to get some petrol as it was just getting dark. And then the car had just died. Luckily in the garage, not on the road. Also luckily, I had roadside assistance with green flag. A grower came out to get us, a French guy, and a little bit surly. He drove us out into the middle of nowhere and we were actually quite scared for a while as it was pitch black and we had no idea where we were. Garage, and we were given two choices: stay in a hotel until the car was ready, which would be a few days as it was a weekend, or stay just one night and we would get a hire car. We could get a hire car the next day to take us back home. Then green flag would fly someone over to get my car and bring it home. I must say I was very impressed with their service, and if they were still in existence I would definitely recommend them. We stayed one night, then took the car hire option. We had so much stuff, it was left to Martine to do most of the lifting, as of course I was pregnant and couldn't. She had to do it all again at Calais and then at Dover, as we were not allowed to take the French hire car over the channel, and we had to get on the ferry as foot passengers. It's a bit of a standing joke now between us how she had to lift everything. I had never been pregnant before, and I did act like a bit of a delicate flower. I was so scared of losing this baby. I was so happy to at last be carrying. It sounds so dramatic, but if any of you ladies reading this or listening to this have longed for a baby and thought you could never have one, you will understand. It becomes a kind of an obsession, and when it finally happens, you just can't believe it. I always felt that something would go wrong and I would never see this baby's face. Once I was home, I made my appointment at the doctor's. There was a heart-stopping moment when at first she could not find the heartbeat, but then suddenly there it was. Boom! There is nothing quite like hearing that for the first time. I did not care that I was not in a relationship with the father. I did not care that I would be a single mother. I did not care about any of it. I was just delighted to be pregnant. The father was married, and we literally only had been together one time. I did briefly thinking about making up a father, but I knew I would never be able to sustain a lie. The truth always comes out in the end. I was dreading telling him, and I was dreading telling Terry, but none of that diminished my delight in being pregnant. Although I will talk about the father in this book, I will never mention his real name. A week went by and the guy from Green Flag jumped on an aeroplane and went to collect my newly repaired car. He delivered it directly to my door in Reading to the house I was sharing with my fellow student. Later that evening, the same day that my car had been returned, I was chatting with one of my sisters on the telephone. As I was doing so, something came through the letterbox. I just assumed it was a leaflet of some kind, though I do remember thinking, oh, it's quite late to be delivering leaflets. When I finished the call, I went over to see what it was. It wasn't a leaflet, it was a letter from Terry. In the letter, he told me in no uncertain terms that he was taking the car as it was half his, and he wanted it. When he had, as I thought kindly, taken the car to get the tyres changed for my trip to Spain, he had also had a copy of the keys made. He would return the car when I came back to live with him, he said. So it was apparent that all those weeks I thought he was moving on, in fact he wasn't. And how had he found out where I lived? When we had split up, the arrangement had been that I would keep the car as I needed it to get to university from London, and he would keep the house. I don't know what shocked me most, the fact that he had sneakily had keys cut whilst pretending to do me a favour, or that he had somehow managed to track me down. The following day I went to his place of work and I kicked up enough fuss, threatening to phone the police to make him tell me where the car was. The car was in my name, at least. He had parked it in a hidden cul-de-sac where I never would have found it, and he had even put a crook lock on it. I got my car back. However, I now had more idea of the lengths he would go to find out where I was living and make my life difficult. I had changed my address with the Labour Party, and he had gone to the secretary of my branch, a mutual friend, with some cock and bull story, and the idiot had told him the new address. The guy, Chris, apologised to me profusely, but I was fuming that he had done that. He could have put me in real danger. He told me that Terry was like a bloodhound in his quest to find out where I was. It was all he talked about. He constantly badgered him, and eventually he'd given in. This could have been very dangerous for me. I had to move again, back to my niece's in London. I was starting to get a very bad feeling about how all this was going to end up. It was now the end of January 1996, 4 months on from when we had first split up. Despite having met someone else, Terry did not seem to be moving on, and due to the sneaky way he'd acted over the car and finding out where I lived, I was becoming increasingly paranoid. He was still constantly ringing my friends and family. I was dreading having to tell him I was pregnant. It was ridiculous though. We'd been apart 4 months and it really wasn't even anything to do with him. The only time he would know where I was for sure was when I was working at a race course. He knew the ones I always attended. I would come to the car park and even check the boot of my car to make sure he was not in there before I drove off. That's how paranoid I was. Terry had left his first wife for his second wife, and his second wife he'd left for me, but I was not allowed to leave him. He told all my friends and family that I was mentally unbalanced, and eventually I would come to my senses. I went to the police to stop him harassing me through my friends and family, and I was told that they could not do anything until he harmed me physically. I do think nowadays there are more laws protecting victims of stalkers, but many women die at the hands of their ex-partners every year, every day. According to Refuge, on average 2 women a week are killed by current or ex-partners in England and Wales alone. Still, people do not take it seriously, I was totally staggered not that long ago when a 30-year-old girl I had working with me as a receptionist said she did not believe women who said they were being stalked. She thought they were being dramatic and overreacting. That's a woman. Unbelievable. I hope for her sake she never experiences any kind of stalking behaviour. It's a horrible feeling to be stalked. It's impossible to explain. Even my own friends and family did not understand my uneasiness and feeling of not feeling safe. And that was amplified by the fact I was pregnant. They would say, "Oh, Terry would never hurt you. He loves you." I was 100% certain that it would hurt me if he got the chance, and if he thought there was no hope of us getting back together. I remembered vividly when he suggested that we commit suicide together. I was not safe, and my baby was not safe either. Finally, I told him that I was pregnant. I told him that the father was someone I'd met on holiday, and I had no contact with him. I could not tell him the truth about my work friend because he knew him. Funnily enough, he was delighted. He thought this was the answer to all our problems. I had wanted a baby, and now I was having one. He would bring it up as if it was his own baby, and we would all live happily ever after. I'll be honest and say there were times that I considered it. It was daunting knowing that I'd be a single parent, and I still had not told the father, and I was dreading his reaction. I was considering not telling him at all. One evening, I went to dinner with Terry at one of our favourite restaurants. I had to see if I had any feelings left and if there was any possibility that we could continue our relationship. There wasn't. I just knew I couldn't do it. He said a disgusting thing to me that I can't even repeat, and there I had my answer, right there and then. When I dropped him off at the house, he asked me to come in. He said he'd bought me some of my favourite cheesecake for dessert. I declined. I could not be alone with him in the house. I just could not wait to get away. I actually felt uneasy in the car. When I think about it now, I should never have even got in a car on my own with him, but anyway. So we were now in February, beginning of February. I was still living at my niece Michelle's house in Edmonton, travelling to university. It was wearing. On Monday, the 13th of February, 1996, I felt quite sick when I got up and I couldn't face the trip to Reading. I called the university and I said I won't be in that day. Someone somewhere was looking over me, and that later that morning a friend from university called me. She told me that Terry was wandering around the university in a terrible state, crying, asking anyone if they knew where I was. She had tried to calm him down and told him she would ring me and ask me to call him. She told him he should go home and calm down or go to work. Terry by then was running his own bookmaker's shop that his mum had given him money for. That evening I called him and withheld the number. He was at home. He was calmer, but he said that if I did not come back there and then, he would kill himself. Of course, I could not go there. There was no way that I could go there. I tried my best to talk to him, but he had only one thing to say: "Come here now, or I will kill myself." I told him that I would ring his sister and ask her to call him, but that I was not coming. And his last words to me were, "I hope I see you on the other side." I rang his sister and told her the situation. What should I do? She said she would call him, then call me back to tell me how it went. I said, tell him I will ring him in the morning. She rang back about an hour later and she said that he seemed better, calmer. He said he would not do anything. And she told him that both of us would ring him the next day, Valentine's Day, February the 14th, 1996. We both felt there was not much else that we could say. She didn't live nearby either. She lived about 2 hours away. It was now late, maybe midnight. We agreed to go to bed and speak again in the morning. I could not sleep, only doze. I was tortured by fears that maybe he'd found out where I was and he was on his way over to kill me. A murder-suicide. You might think that sounds dramatic or ridiculous, but if you'd been in my position, you might have felt differently. I knew he was unhinged. I just did not know what to do about it. If you've read any of my blogs, you'll know that I believe in spirituality. Things happen that we can't account for. At around 3 or 4 that morning, I was awoken with a start. I had a vision or a dream, I do not know which. I saw a hooded figure very sadly waiting for Terry. My stomach flipped over and I knew at this moment he was no longer on this earth. That's the end of part 5.